He was thrown out of the taxi, right in the middle of the street, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, simply because he was wearing a red MAGA hat. The driver shouted insults loudly, relishing his moment of fame, completely unaware of whom he was humiliating. But when the truth about the passenger was revealed, it shattered all of the antagonist's illusions. What happened next changed not only their lives, but the entire city. John Harper, the mayor of a small town in Oklahoma, was a man of strong convictions. After a busy day at a city council meeting, he ordered a taxi through a popular app. He wore his usual red MAGA hat, a symbol he saw as representative of his beliefs and freedom of expression. The car arrived quickly, a yellow sedan bearing the logo of the local taxi service. Behind the wheel sat a man in his 40s with a dour expression. John greeted the driver and took a seat in the back, providing his home address. The driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, noticed John's hat and immediately tensed up. His face twisted with displeasure before he abruptly turned around. "Is that a MAGA hat?" he asked sharply. Sensing the tension, John calmly replied, "Yes, it is. Is there a problem?" "Problem?" The driver's voice grew louder. "I'm not driving people like you. Your views offend people in this city." "I'm sorry, but I don't see why my political beliefs should affect how you treat me as a customer," John replied evenly. "Get out of my car," the driver demanded, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. John remained composed, but began to realize the situation was taking an unpleasant turn. He attempted to reason with the driver. "I've already paid for the ride through the app. It's your duty as a driver," he said. The driver, Carl, jumped out of the car, opened the back door, and loudly declared, "No, you're not riding in my car. Get out, or I'll call the police." The shouting drew the attention of passers-by. Several people stopped, and some began recording the incident on their phones. John exited the car, careful not to escalate the conflict. "Are you sure you want to take this to the extreme?" he asked calmly, looking Carl straight in the eye. "Yes, people like you are ruining our city," Carl shouted. Realizing further discussion was futile, John replied briefly, "All right, that's your choice, but I think you'll regret it." The crowd murmured, discussing the scene. Carl, now puffed up with pride, got back into his car and drove off, while John, maintaining his composure, headed to the nearest bus stop. A few bystanders approached him, expressing their support. "This is outrageous. How can taxi drivers get away with this?" one said. John thanked them for their kind words, but preferred not to inflame the situation, remarking only that sometimes people create problems for themselves that ultimately backfire. The next morning, John woke up to find the video of the confrontation circulating on social media, quickly gaining thousands of views. Hundreds of comments debated the driver's blatant discrimination based on political beliefs. John silently watched the clip, smiled, and said to himself, "Here we go." By the next day, Carl, the taxi driver, had become a local celebrity. His name appeared in headlines, and the video of the incident spread across social media. In the video, Carl proudly declared he wouldn't drive people like that man in the MAGA hat. Many hailed him as a hero, while others criticized him for his prejudice, but Carl basked in the attention. Encouraged by the support, Carl decided to appear on local radio. Speaking in a boastful tone, he explained his stance. "We, the everyday people, shouldn't have to tolerate symbols of hate. If I have to kick someone else out for wearing that hat, I'll do it without hesitation," he declared. The radio host interjected, "But don't your actions violate your company's policy? You're obligated to serve all customers." "The company?" Carl scoffed. "If they fire me, I'll find work elsewhere. Principles matter more than money." Meanwhile, public reaction grew increasingly divided. Social media users began speculating about the identity of the passenger Carl had kicked out. A few recognized John Harper, but their comments were lost in the flood of opinions. John stayed silent, quietly observing the unfolding drama. Carl, emboldened by his newfound fame, decided to double down. He recorded a video standing next to his taxi. "To everyone wearing MAGA hats, if you think we're going to drive you around, think again. "This city isn't a place for your politics," he proclaimed. The video sparked a storm of reactions. Some cheered Carl on, while others condemned his actions as blatant discrimination. Meanwhile, complaints about Carl began flooding the headquarters of the taxi service. The company issued a statement condemning his behavior, but hesitated to take immediate action amid the public uproar. Feeling untouchable, Carl accepted an invitation to a local talk show. Confident in his righteousness, he appeared in the studio. The host posed a direct question. "Do you think your behavior was ethical? After all, you refused to serve someone who had paid for the ride." "Ethical?" Carl sneered. "These people make life worse for all of us with their views. I was just protecting our city." Among the audience at the talk show sat John, silently listening and waiting for the right moment. Carl, at the height of his self-assurance, had no idea how quickly things were about to change. Meanwhile, journalists began digging deeper to identify the passenger Carl had humiliated. One of them confirmed it was none other than the town's mayor. The revelation exploded across local media like a bombshell. Carl was the last to find out, learning only after the news broke. His confidence started to waver, but he tried to save face, declaring, "So what if he's the mayor? That doesn't change anything. I stood by my beliefs." Finally, John decided to make his move. He accepted an invitation to speak at a public forum, promising to address all questions. Carl also planned to attend, confident he could once again make a bold statement. However, he had no idea that he was walking into a situation that would leave him utterly humiliated. On the day of the public forum, the town square was packed with people. Journalists, activists, and curious residents eager to see how the situation would unfold. Carl, still confident in his righteousness, arrived holding a sign that read, "No MAGA in our city." He took a seat in the front row, ready to speak up if given the chance. The forum began with discussions about the town's current issues. John Harper, as always, remained calm and professional. He talked about plans to improve the city's infrastructure, enhance safety, and address other pressing matters. Carl sat in the audience, occasionally shouting remarks such as, "You should focus on real problems instead of defending those hateful hats." The crowd reacted differently. Some cheered for Carl, while others frowned at him in disapproval. John ignored the interruptions, continuing his speech. At one point, however, he paused, scanned the audience, and said, "Before we move on, I'd like to share a story. A story about how bias can lead to misunderstandings and conflict." The crowd fell silent, their attention fully on him. John continued. "A few days ago, I, like any regular resident of our city, called a taxi. I wore my usual hat, a symbol of my beliefs. But the driver refused to take me. Not only that, but he made it loud, public, and, I'd say, unnecessarily humiliating." Carl began to squirm in his seat. He tried to interject, but John raised a hand, signaling him to wait. "That driver perhaps didn't know who I was. He just saw the hat and decided he had the right to judge me as a person," John continued. That incident, as you might have guessed, was captured on video and shared widely online. The crowd murmured among themselves. Some began to connect the dots, while Carl still couldn't believe this was about him. John paused, then smiled and looked directly at Carl. "And that driver, as it turns out, is here with us today, sitting in this very room." The crowd gasped, and all eyes turned to Carl. His face went pale, and he began stammering. I didn't know who you were." "Exactly," John said calmly. "You didn't know who I was. But does that matter? Does a passenger need to be the mayor to deserve respect?" The audience erupted in applause. Carl tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. John raised his hand, calling for silence. "I hold no grudge against this man," John said. "But I hope this incident serves as a lesson for all of us. We should not judge people based on their appearance, political beliefs, or symbols." Carl looked lost and defeated. For the first time during his brief moment of fame, he realized he had lost the respect of even those who once supported him. The crowd dispersed, satisfied that justice had been served. But John knew this wasn't the end. The real challenge lay ahead, to ensure the lesson was learned and the consequences of this story led to meaningful change. After the forum, Carl became the subject of widespread criticism, not only on social media, but also among his colleagues. Many saw his actions as not just a mistake, but a glaring example of bias and discrimination. The taxi company began receiving a flood of customer complaints, forcing management to launch an internal investigation to determine how Carl's actions violated company policies. Meanwhile, John decided that Carl's punishment shouldn't be purely punitive. He believed true justice wasn't just about retribution, but also about creating an opportunity for growth. John launched a citywide campaign promoting respect and tolerance, starting with training sessions for service industry workers. "We'll begin with taxi drivers," he said during a meeting with local transportation companies. "People working with the public need to understand the importance of courtesy and respect, regardless of personal beliefs." Carl's company agreed to support the initiative. Carl was given an ultimatum. Either he attended all the training sessions, or he would lose his taxi license. Realizing he had no other choice, Carl reluctantly agreed. At the first training session, led by an invited expert, Carl sat in the back corner, his face clouded with resentment. John was also present but kept a low profile, observing Carl's reactions. During one exercise, participants were asked to write down how they would feel if they were publicly humiliated like Carl's passenger had been. Carl hesitated for a long time before finally writing, "Shame and anger at myself." After the session, John approached Carl and said calmly, "We all need lessons sometimes. The important thing is that you're willing to learn." Carl nodded silently. His pride was shattered, but he understood that he had to move forward. Weeks later, John organized a citywide event celebrating the new campaign, titled "A City Without Prejudice." During the event, Carl was invited to speak publicly. Standing on stage, his voice shaky but genuine, he addressed the crowd. "I was wrong. My behavior was unacceptable. I've realized that I have no right to judge people based on their appearance or beliefs. Thank you to everyone who helped me see that." The audience applauded. John joined Carl on stage and shook his hand, symbolizing that everyone deserves a second chance. Carl's story became a powerful lesson for the entire town. John's campaign gained momentum and was soon adopted by neighboring cities. As for Carl, he continued working as a taxi driver, but now he greeted every passenger with a smile and without prejudice. Watching this transformation, John knew he had accomplished his goal. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the city had become a little better.